Okay, we can start our fourth and last session, chaired by my friend Giandomenico Iannetti, who was co-fellow here last academic year at the Institut d'études avancées, and who is neurologist both based in London University, and at the Istituto Italiano di Tecnologie in Rome, specialist of pain experience. Hopefully we won't experience any pain during the afternoon. And thank you very much, Giandomenico.
Thank you, Andrea. He's been modest. We actually shared an office in this building for almost a year, so that's a much stronger bond. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's try to keep attention for this last session of the meeting. And this afternoon will be mostly listen to talks about illusions and illusory states and distortion of self-experiences. And we will see how these kind of things contribute to the sense of self, to selfhood. The first speaker is Olaf Blanke, who's an eminent neuroscientist, a leading figure in the field. He's professor at the EPFL in Lausanne, based in Geneva, and he will talk about the neuroscience of self-consciousness to virtual reality, Digiceuticals, and human augmentations. Fasten your seatbelt and enjoy.
So, as the title says, so I changed my title a little bit, and also put the word avatar directly in it, and out-of-body experiences and ghosts. And I think the notion of the double, like we've heard this morning, will also come because, as I'd like to argue in this next half hour, the representation of the body by the brain is, in our approach, or in my approach to consciousness, a very prominent way, not just to study consciousness, but to study a subform of. Can I go back? Okay. Okay. To study a subform of consciousness, which is self-consciousness, and I think that's going to be interesting to discuss for other aspects we have talked about already over yesterday and this morning. So obviously consciousness has been a cornerstone of philosophy and will remain so for many years to come. The neurosciences brings yet another approach, bringing an empirical approach to it, like psychology did or cognitive science did. And there is, to give one example, and this is almost a criticism of the field, consciousness study, particularly in Paris, as I was just discussing with Alain Berthaud, focuses very much on visual consciousness. And there's many reasons why this is interesting. There's beautiful illusions like these white squares that you see all have similar luminance, they all have similar physical whiteness, but clearly for many aspects in this illusion we perceive them as clearly different levels of gray. And there's an amalgam, of course, other visual illusions that have been studied. So these are demonstrative, showing the limits of perception, although we have knowledge that this is actually not the case, that these two lines are, for example, that these two lines have the same length, they clearly do look different, but these are interesting stimuli that people that have allowed to approach consciousness in the research lab. And of course, brain imaging technologies developed over the last 20 years have allowed to give us yet another description of what's going on in the brain while people are doing these perceptions, and what can we understand more by having this not just psychological but biological stance on consciousness. So but what I'd like to talk about today more is a multisensory form of consciousness, an integrated form of consciousness. And even if we look at perceptual consciousness and looking at this element of visual consciousness, I think it's 90% of consciousness researchers, almost, I exaggerate a bit, focus on visual consciousness. And I don't really know why that is, apart from methodological considerations. But obviously there's auditory, tactile, gustatory, motor consciousness, all these different forms of consciousness. However, consciousness is very much a multisensory experience, multisensory perception. So what my lab focuses on, and other people I see in this room very much as well, focusing on multisensory consciousness. Why? Because we and others think that it may give an approach an access towards self-consciousness, particularly bodily self-consciousness, because consciousness, as I write here, is multisensory and an integrated unitary experience, right? I don't feel separate, don't have separate perceptions for the blue chair, for the red walls, for maybe sound of the projector that I experience. It's a unitary global experience, and most of all these conscious states are mental states of someone. Their experiences for someone, and this generally relates to the subject of conscious experience. And what I'll try to convey to you in the next 25 minutes is our empirical work in neuroscience on this idea of how or what systems in the brain could be involved in generating this feeling we all have of being the subject of experience. And again, the body representation in the brain is very important for this. And if there is errors in this processing, as I will argue, then this gives rise to experienced avatars, experienced doubles that can be seen not so much in the way of Freud seeing his mirror image or Mel seeing his mirror image reflection, but to see a mirror image, if you want, without there being a mirror. So these are the kind of states that I'm talking about. Okay, I've said this already. So how can we approach and study multisensory consciousness in the research laboratory? So this is an illusion that we haven't developed, but that many people have used, and it's based on, let me briefly just explain it to you. Oh, has anybody, are you familiar with a rubber hand illusion, or who is not familiar with a rubber hand illusion? Okay, so this is the experimenter, this is the experimental subject, and there is a cardboard here or something else that prevents him from directly seeing his left hand, and there is a paintbrush or anything, some other device that can stimulate apply a tactile cue at this position, and then with the other hand, on this fake hand, also a left fake hand, a second stimulus is applied, a visual stimulus. So you put into synchrony a visual stimulus on this fake hand and a felt tactile stimulus on this hidden hand. And you do this for a little while, and so the brain learns to integrate those two. And you could see there's a certain distance here, and the timing is synchronously. Okay? And so what happens in this, I think I'll play it one more time. So there is a synchronous stimulation, and so hand position is encoded for this person by proprioceptive cues telling him where his hand is in space, and then he gets this other visual cue which tells him where another hand is in space. And normally, obviously, those two cues are fully integrated because I only see and feel touches coming from the same hand. By dissociating them in this way, by an additional tactile cue, there's visual dominance over those proprioceptive cues where the hand is in space. And you can induce two changes, many other changes, but two people have focused on since we talk about consciousness or self-consciousness. One is ownership. So if you later on give subjects questionnaires about whether they perceive this fake hand, this pink glove, as their own hand, after 2 minutes of the stroking, they will affirmatively respond to this question. And then, since we're in the research lab, if you, for example, introduce a delay between the seen hand and the felt hand, then this illusion breaks down. People will not agree with the statement anymore that this is their hand. And another measurement to objectify this is if you ask people afterwards with the right index finger to point where their real hand, which is now not sure which one it is, the proprioceptively one defined or the visual one defined, but obviously we're asking people to tell us where their hand is in space, something that should be an easy task. There is a change in position recalibration. So people with eyes closed don't point towards the position of the hidden hand, but they show a drift towards the visual hand, so that we also have objective ways. There are other ones to measure this. So what we and others, Hendrik Ersen and also Mel Slater has showed you this morning many examples, is we used something very similar but for the full body. And for this we used virtual reality, we used an avatar. The movie hadn't been out yet, so we called it virtual body at the time. So what people do in our experiment, this is the experimental subjects wearing a head-mounted display, and she would see, in this case, wearing the head-mounted display here, she sees what's shown on the screen, on this image here. So there is a second body in front of her. So this is maybe more easily shown here. So you have our participant standing here wearing a head-mounted display. There's a camera 2 meters behind, and then what the subject sees is a virtual body standing in front. So you see a body here and you feel a body here. Pretty much like our example that I've showed you before from the rubber hand illusion, where there was a hidden hand and there was a seen hand. And what we do what we did, and many others have done similar things, we now apply a touch cue at the back, which is felt at the back, but is seen 2 meters in front. So you have very similar paradigm that we had before for the hand, but now for the full body in space. And when you do this, again, for a period of 2 minutes, you can induce, again, several kinds of changes. One change is that you will self-attribute, or you'll have affirmative statements. I think somebody asked this morning about first-person methodology. We can discuss whether this is first-person methodology or not, but we give them questionnaires, and they are supposed to rate how strongly they felt to be located where the body is. And under synchronous conditions, meaning the stroking is felt at the same time that it is seen, then people identify with the avatar, with the virtual body that they see. And this can be a female or a male avatar. It works independently of those mechanisms. But if we do, and in addition, when we ask people to indicate the position where they have been standing during the illusion, there's also this drift, a sort of recalibration. So it's as if the center of awareness is not located where it should all be in all of us right now, more or less around the body or in a parapersonal space, but it's shifted towards the virtual, towards the avatar's position. And these two changes break down if, for example, we do not show a virtual body, we show a virtual control object, a square, for example, or we show empty space. It also breaks down when the stroking that I see is not temporally synchronous with the stroking that I feel. So these are just different scenarios that in the rubber hand illusion, but also in the enfacement illusion that Anna Sforza and Salvatore Aglioli has tested. So between hands, between faces, and between bodies, trunks, torsos, there is a very similar mechanism for different body parts that leads to ownership and changes, as we argue, in bodily self-consciousness. I will be brief on the neuroscience. So we've worked actually very hard on adapting this avatar illusion towards the scanning environment. So I don't know if you're familiar, but this is like a scanner environment in order to get to brain imaging data. So there's 70 centimeters of space. You're in supine position. There's a lot of noise in there. So we built these MRI-compatible robots that applied the stroking while people were basically, this is a monostroker with a back on this, and then you have to imagine wearing a head-mounted display in the scanner and to see an avatar stroked, seen as being stroked in the same way. So it is the same illusion I presented you before, but now in the supine position while we're measuring the brain activity. So one response that we observed now was very similar. We predicted this very, very clearly because, so this is the physical position of the person in the scanner. And there was, again, this self-identification with the avatar, which could be induced in very similar ways. But at this, when we measured where people located their center of awareness, there was, again, this shift away from the physical body of our subjects towards the avatar's body. So, however, there was a different group which reacted in a very interesting way. First of all, they also showed these changes in drift, from a baseline position to another position, but they felt to be inverted. They did not feel, although they knew perfectly well that they were positioned or that they were lying on their back and looking upwards, they felt to be suspended in the air and looking downwards. And we think, maybe we can discuss it too, but it's basically in this body that they were watching above them, there were gravity cues, which he didn't purposefully put in the paradigm, but you can see that his arms are kind of hanging downwards, and obviously we filmed this person that we used in the scanner on a tabletop from above. So it seems that some people are visually very sensitive to vestibular gravity direction cues that were given in those stimuli. And much of our work, actually, I'd say about a third of the work in the lab is really dedicated to now having a system, a protocol like this to really understand the fine-grained mechanisms which brain systems are involved in this illusion. And we focus in particular about a region around the right temporal gyrus. But again, as this image also shows, it's very much a network, like Alain Berthoz has also mentioned yesterday. So this is what I mentioned already: the right temporal-parietal junction, the cortex, so the parietal lobe here, the end of the temporal cortex here, and we had these fMRI related activation shown in red here. So this is a region that reflects, or the activity level in this region will reflect how much I self-attribute the avatar, how much it depends on the synchrony of stroking and on this perspective effect that I mentioned. So it's quite a selective activity pattern that we could find here. And interestingly, much of the research that I just presented to you was based on findings, on clinical findings that we had at the time on so-called out-of-body experiences. And in those sensations, or others, you can also refer this, so you find this in the literature under the term of astral travel. But what is typical about the out-of-body experience, which is, by the way, occurring in about 5% of the general population, is that there is a phenomenon or an experience very much like the second group of subjects, which I mentioned before, that seems to be rotated in space and to be looking back downward. So if you would have if I would have an out-of-body experience in the room right now, I would be hovering under the ceiling and have a first-person view perspective and looking down upon the whole group, including myself. And the level of awareness is pretty much like awareness that we all have right now. And what we observed in a few patients back in Geneva, and this is shown for one patient here, where each time we applied a current, again, in this region that's indicated in red, for 2 seconds, there was an out-of-body experience. So there was this rotation and drift and complex sensory experience for the 2 seconds of stimulation, and then the person was back here in her body at the time. We confirmed this not just in one patient, but this is shown here in blue, in a group of 9 individuals. So this region seems to do something quite fundamental about generating a bodily form of self-consciousness, a global form, a me in space, or an I in space. It's not really objectified, it's not a third-person descriptor, it's rather me or an I looking at space, and it can be shifted either by neurological interference, as I show you here, or by our robotic stimulation using also virtual reality in the scanner. Obviously, again, this is not something that is just discovered apart from the neural mechanisms very recently. It's a very old phenomenon that also has been depicted in many images. You find it, of course, in movies. You find it particular in Egyptian tradition, and in the 20th century, this is taken from Sylvain Muldoon, a book on astral projection, as it was called, published in 1929 with Herbert Carrington. You find very similar depictions. So you find these 2 representations of a body. So there is the body as defined physically, and then there is a body or self-location defined by subjective experience, if you want. And the images shown and the way it is represented is very similar across all these conditions. So the only thing really that we did in addition, major achievement for us, but from idea of things, maybe a small step, is that we go towards empirical induction in the lab, which is a necessity obviously for the scientist, and then looking at neurologically induced forms or experimentally induced forms and compare those mechanisms in the brain. I think I'll skip this part, but this is just one type of tool, those kind of tools that I've presented to you. We're trying to use engineering techniques in many different forms. Alain Berthoz will like this picture. This is a vestibular rotating chair. So the vestibular information, decoding gravity, but also accelerations, is a very important system for bodily self-consciousness. Very important will also be to get virtual reality to be a mobile system. And obviously, many of our experiments, we always have to link them to the scanning or to other forms of brain imaging environments. So what is this good for? Just one application, or of course it is good for just understanding how the brain creates some of the illusory states that others have discussed as well, like the form of a double, is something that interference with a system I too briefly described to you can lead to the impression of visually seeing a second or a double, a duplicated form of yourself in front of you. But what is most important is that, in my perspective, of course, that this kind of approach, going through avatars and working with out-of-body experience, but experimentally induced, we can come up with an understanding or advance with an understanding of self-consciousness through multisensory bodily perception. Our hypothesis, I've shown it here, first of all, it's an integrated form of multisensory integration. It's a low-level account of self-consciousness. So we had that yesterday, I think, also in a talk that focusing between anthropomorphic or bodily representations and cognitive representations. And so what is interesting or important for me, that this is first of all a neuroscientific approach, which is a low-level account of self-consciousness. Cognitive science has a tradition of also using many cognitive approaches to understand self-consciousness, autobiographical memory, thought and language. The narrative self is linked with Dan Dennett, for example, visual mirror recognition. So this approach is fundamentally different by proposing something multisensory bodily as a low-level account, which is maybe a neurobiological basis for later forms of consciousness, of course, that humans are most famous for, which are based on language, memory, and other concepts, of course, that we all share. And then one part that maybe in the discussion we can come towards this, so instead of hands or faces or feet, which have also representations obviously in our brain, I converge most recently on the idea that particularly torso-centered, trunk-centered coding is of most relevance when trying to come up with a global account of self-consciousness. Just one applications, Andrea, you said not too much pain in this afternoon, so there's just 2 slides about phantom limb pain and amputees. So this is collaboration work with Silvestro Micera, who is at EPFL and also in Pisa, and he has established a line of work. This is an amputee, Dennis, an amputee patient, and he has a bionic limb. So this is special in the way that nerve fibers still persisting in his limb can be accessed directly via implant electrodes, and these implant electrodes can achieve 2 things. One is they can decode movement patterns from the motor nerves in order to make this hand move. I think I can start the video. It's actually a very nice video. And so by decoding nerve signals from, let's say, his median nerve, from his residual limb, the patient, Dennis, can learn within several months to move the arm and can close the hand without crushing, obviously, the hand of Stani, who is doing the testing here. But what Silvestro has been known for is also there's not just a reading out of motor signals, but there's also a write-in of sensory information. So in these nerves, we can stimulate these nerves as well, and they're perceived as if the phantom, the prosthetic hand limb would be touched. So as you can see here, there is something that is held in the hand, that's stimulating with the hand. There are sensors in the hand, and whenever they sense something, this leads to a brain stimulus that's written into the brain signal. So what we have done is a very simple observation. Remember the rubber hand illusion that I started my talk with? So what we did here is we had a prosthetic form of rubber hand illusion, and that's what the video on the right. So basically we use this the same patient, so we're writing in signals. You see these yellow signals going into the nerve, and this is a tactile cue, just like in the rubber hand illusion before, where the hand was stimulated. And while the patient perceives a touch cue in his prosthetic limb written in by the nerve, we also show on a head-mounted display a hand which is illuminated at exactly the same position. So instead of stimulating the hand and hiding it and showing a visual hand representation like in the classical rubber hand illusion, we now have a much more controlled, if you want, a rubber hand illusion set up here in this prosthetic limb. So each time he puts on the head-mounted display and is watching a virtual representation of his phantom hand, we can stimulate not only the nerve to induce a sensation of touch, but also visualize the exact position that the patient would feel to be touched. And by integrating this, we were able to observe several things. First of all, you're not surprised. We can induce ownership for a part of space where there's actually no hand present. Much more interesting for us in 2 other patients was to see that many of these patients suffer from phantom limb pain. And so this was able to reduce one phenomenon that is linked, associated with phantom limb pain. This is called telescoping. So many amputees initially feel a phantom limb at the physical position, but during recovery actually, and if the phantom is painful, not only does the phantom limb remain, but it's also retracted, telescoping back towards the stump position. And several days of exposure with short presentations actually were able to normalize this back to the original position. So just as one explication or one example how this work on bodily self-consciousness can also be applied in medical research, for example, next to being involved in basic research. So the last topic is, as Mel said, now to something completely different. It is about ghosts and seen under the form of a non-visual double, or presented as a non-visual double. Again, the first data suggesting this, there's old data again in literature, and particularly French neurology and Viennese neurology in the first half of the 20th century. But of course, these presences, you can find them pretty much in fiction. Just since we're here in Paris, Guy de Maupassant, Le Horla, this is where I took this quote from, and also August Strindberg, a fantastic account in Inferno, also his time here in Paris. And I think an important line is here, for example, qu'il existe près de moi un être invisible. So if you want an invisible double, and doué par conséquent d'une nature matérielle bien que imperceptible pour nos sens et qui habite comme moi sous mon toit. Donc it's parapersonal, it's an invisible being, it's somebody else, it's not me. And it's described on many pages of the short book Le Horla, and Strindberg has very similar accounts. Now you find this not only in fiction, you find this also in several ascents that Reinhold Messner has actually described, especially above the death zone of 6,000 meters. And he is, as you know, the first to climb Mount Everest with Peter Habeler without supplemental oxygen. And this is on the descent of Nanga Parbat, which is also one of the 8,000 meter mountains that he ascended. You find something very similar that you've seen in Le Horla. So Reinhold Messner felt a third climber, so him, his brother, and then there was the third man, if you want, descending with us, keeping a regular distance, a little to my right, a few steps away from me, just outside my field of vision. So it's like whenever he looks, he couldn't see anybody, but as soon as he looked back forward, the person was there again. It's an on and off phenomenon, and especially in mountaineering, very often it's felt as a companion, a helpful companion who gives generally good advice what to do in situations of great danger. Again, very much like before, the same experience. We could say that's described by Strindberg and by Le Horla, at least the phenotype of the experience that Messner described, and many others described, shipwreck survivors as well. We could induce it once, again, very simple, if you want, under the very difficult medical situation, by having electrodes implanted in a patient suffering from pharmacoresistant epilepsy, like the first patient with an out-of-body experience. And here we stimulated this region, and each time we stimulated, that person also felt somebody present. But she was, of course, not at 8,000 meters altitude, even though this is Switzerland, this is Geneva, 500 meters, only that she didn't know or hadn't shown any particular interest in these sensations. But what is, again, interesting and important here to do, we're not just having a first-person methodology, if you want, asking people to describe their experience a decade later, an hour later, or in other forms, but we could, again, in these 2-second exposures, also do a few changes and see what happens. Because what we're able to show in these short stimulation trials, when we changed position of the patient, shown here in white, the double also changed position. And in Messner's description, we could also see this. The double, or the invisible third man, kept a certain distance and was moving when Messner was moving and stopped when Messner was moving. So there's a very strong, almost like a Kinect, is active and tries to keep the movements of the avatar connected with those of the patient in this case. So what we were able to show again, or I think only show in this case, and it's only suggested by these other anecdotal reports, is that these ghosts or presences are illusory own body perceptions. They're perceptions of my body for which my brain makes an error, and if this is under these particular instances, it's perceived as somebody else. If that misperception, my body is correctly perceived here, and I perceive another human body behind me, which is somehow linked to my own bodily movements, the human brain responds in a way to say, this must be somebody else. It cannot be me. So a different way of responding than to the out-of-body experience, where we also had a duplicated body, but we also had these visual information about the other body. Again, the temporoparietal junction is the key region. This is one part of neuroscience or neurology. And in this way, that's why neurologists have always classified actually these presence sensations or ghost experiences as a phantom body, just like the phantom limb. But in this case, I don't just feel another limb at a position where physically this is nothing else, but I feel an entire body at this position. And if I feel another body of myself, the conscious experience is that I perceive actually another person to be present. Now, question again: how can you bring this to the research lab? And obviously, these patients are rare. Obviously, we're not going to go up to the Himalayas to follow someone and do brain imaging. So I see Gian Domenico is coming up already, but there is a long list of. Starting with Larry Weisskranz, which gets forgotten a bit about more recent work by Sarah Jane Blakemore and Chris Frith on this, that there's a whole range of sensory motor conflicts, meaning you make a movement and you add a delay, and you make a movement and the feedback signal comes back to your own body, le touchant touché de Merleau-Ponty, if we want. There's a long tradition of these illusions, but again, they have focused on the hand representation or the foot representation. So what we did again, just in the avatar illusion, is to have setups using robotics. In this case, it's a blindfolded subject, and so we have a motor signal in the front and a feedback signal in the back, and there's delays and spatial mismatch that we can induce in a controlled fashion. And this is the work by Giulio Ronini in the lab, and if we use this system and you see there's a strong delay, meaning he moves at a different time, and then he receives the feedback. Not only do we find these classical effects that other people had observed, so you feel that you're not the one causing the movement, and when it's asynchronously in the dark condition here, you don't feel that you're actually touching yourself. But most important for us was the feeling of a presence that we're able to do in very neutral, empirically controlled condition here in the research lab. You're not surprised, so we are working now on also trying to understand the brain mechanisms involved and compare multisensory integration, like in this out-of-body illusion type setup with the sensation you have here. And another application, which I as a neurologist am particularly interested in, the feeling of a presence is actually not most frequent on the Himalayas or in fiction or even in our research lab. It's 50% of patients with Parkinson's disease who have, if they start hallucinating, which is happening very frequently for advanced forms of Parkinson's disease. The presence hallucination is one of the first hallucinations that these patients will have. And I think having an experimental way and testing it, particularly in that clinical population, should be very important to understand the phenomenon, but maybe also use this as a very early form of biomarker for detecting this negative form of Parkinson's disease, which is not just associated with hallucinations, but also with memory and Alzheimer type problems. Again, to sum up, just 2 slides. So I have hoped to show you that by working on a very old a problem which will remain with us for a long time, there is also a solid empirical approach from the neurosciences towards self-consciousness. So it's not all of consciousness, it's just one subform of consciousness, and that self-consciousness is based, at least partly and fundamentally, on the brain's representation of the body, in particular the torso, in a distributed cortical system. So this is not one or two regions only, this is a distributed systems, and avatars, doubles, ghost, and out-of-body experiences are very important phenotypes that allow us, first of all, to approach the self-consciousness through an altered state of self-consciousness, to link to the clinic, to link to altered states in healthy participants, but also to these experimentally induced forms using robotics and virtual reality. And obviously they are of importance for neuroscience, also for art, as we've seen several examples here at the conference. And I haven't talked about it, but also for well-being, I think there's an interesting potential. The mission is obviously not accomplished at all. There's many questions that actually can be asked in different ways. It's still not clear from a neuroscientist's point of view why are certain parts of the brain responsible for conscious experience but not others. What makes the difference, right? What are the neuromechanistic data that we need to have to move forward? Are there other species on the planet that are self-conscious? Having this empirical approach and avoiding language and avoiding many of the typical human cognitions, we can ask these questions, right? It feels like about chimpanzees, we don't even want to ask that question. It seems to be very obvious, but like Alain, like we discussed before, for a macaque or for a rodent, it's questions that I think could at least partly be experimentally approached. I mean, a bit more direct maybe. Are babies conscious? Are babies self-conscious? Do they have self-consciousness? This can also theoretically then be approached empirically, and we don't have actually answers. As scientists, we don't have answers to these questions, and of course today very much talk about machines can be conscious and self-conscious, and last of all, we don't even have agreement what consciousness is there for, right? People like Dennett deny that this is anything meaningful. It's just a side effect of an epiphenomenon of evolution, but it's still not clear what consciousness or self-consciousness is for. So many questions will remain. Thank you.